If you've ever driven down an empty back road at night, you know the feeling. The world shrinks to the edges of your headlights, and every shadow feels alive. That's where I was, somewhere deep in the Pacific Northwest, miles from the nearest town, staring down the glowing sign of a gas station that shouldn't have existed. If you ever find yourself in that situation, just keep driving. Don't stop, don't look back. Before we dive into this chilling story, make sure you subscribe to Unexpected Horrors for more spine-tingling tales and gripping content that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Hit that like button if you love a good horror story, and let's get started. Marcus Porter wasn't the kind of person who's scared easily. At 28 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life chasing danger for the sake of a good story. A photojournalist by trade, Marcus had made a name for himself documenting the forgotten corners of America, the places most people ignored or outright avoided. Abandoned towns, crumbling factories, overgrown cemeteries, those were his bread and butter. He liked to say he didn't believe in ghosts, but the truth was more complicated. Marcus believed in stories, and if a good ghost story sold magazines or went viral online, he wasn't above leaning into the mystery. Marcus was resourceful, self-reliant, and a bit too confident for his own good. He drove a beat-up Jeep Wrangler he called Old Faithful, a vehicle he trusted more than most people, and he had a knack for finding trouble where no one else dared to look. He was also a night owl, often working until dawn, chasing the perfect shot. But the darkness didn't bother him, not until that night. It started as a routine trip. Marcus had been hired to put together a photo essay on the hidden beauty of the Pacific Northwest. He'd spent the day capturing misty mountain vistas and lush green forests, losing himself in the sheer vastness of the region. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he found himself on a winding two-lane road cutting through an endless forest. The GPS on his phone flickered in and out, and the comforting bars of cell service disappeared entirely. Marcus didn't mind. He liked the isolation, the sense of being untethered from the world. He had his camera bag on the passenger seat, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and the soft hum of a local radio station to keep him company. But as the night deepened, a low, persistent fog began to creep in, swallowing the trees and narrowing his field of vision to the stretch of asphalt directly in front of him. Then it happened. Old Faithful started to sputter. At first, it was just a faint hiccup in the engine, barely noticeable over the sound of the tires on the road. But within minutes, it became impossible to ignore. The Jeep lurched, its headlights flickering as the engine made a sound like a dying animal. Marcus gritted his teeth, knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Come on, not now," he muttered. He pulled over to the side of the road, the Jeep's engine coughing one last time before falling silent. Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. He popped the hood and stepped out into the night, immediately hit by the damp chill of the fog. The engine didn't look good. He wasn't a mechanic, but even he could tell something was seriously wrong. He checked his phone, no signal, typical. That's when he saw it. Through the fog, just ahead, a faint neon glow pierced the darkness. At first, he thought he might be imagining it, a trick of the light or his sleep-deprived mind. But as he squinted, the shape of a gas station came into focus. It was small and unassuming, like something out of a 1950s postcard. A single pump stood under a rusted awning, and a weathered sign flickered above the door. "Gas," in red letters. Marcus felt a surge of relief. He grabbed his flashlight and his wallet, locking the Jeep behind him as he started walking. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine, and his footsteps echoed unnaturally in the stillness. The closer he got, the stranger the gas station looked. It wasn't just old. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. The paint was peeling, the windows were clouded with grime, and the pump looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But the neon sign was lit, and that was good enough for Marcus. He stepped under the awning, his boots crunching on the cracked pavement, and peered through the window. Inside, the gas station looked as outdated as its exterior. Rows of dusty shelves lined with canned goods, faded magazines, and glass bottles of soda filled the small space. Behind the counter, a single light bulb cast a sickly yellow glow over a man who looked like he'd been carved out of stone. The man was ancient, his skin leathery and pale as wax. He wore a tattered flannel shirt and a trucker hat pulled low over his eyes, which never left the counter. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the act of existing was an unbearable effort. Marcus hesitated. Something about the man made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the feeling aside. He needed gas, and he wasn't about to let some creepy old-timer scare him off. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the quiet. The man didn't respond. "Hey, my car broke down a little ways back. Do you sell gas?" The man lifted his head, just enough for Marcus to catch a glimpse of his eyes. Milky white, like twin moons shrouded in mist. His lips parted, revealing teeth that were more yellow than white. "Pumps out front," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Pay here." Marcus nodded, pulling out his wallet. As he approached the counter, he noticed something odd, a wooden sign hanging on the wall behind the man. The letters were carved by hand, rough and uneven. "You pay with more than cash here." Marcus frowned, his curiosity piqued. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, jerking his thumb toward the sign. The man didn't answer. He simply stared at Marcus, his milky eyes unblinking. Unease crept over Marcus, but he shoved it down. He paid for the gas and stepped back outside, forcing himself to breathe deeply. It was just a gas station, he told himself. Just an old man and a rundown pump. There was nothing to be afraid of. As he filled his tank, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in on him like a living thing. The forest was silent, the usual chirps and rustles of the night conspicuously absent. He glanced back at the gas station and froze. The old man was standing in the doorway, watching him. Marcus shivered, suddenly desperate to leave. Marcus didn't want to look back. He didn't want to feel the weight of that man's gaze on the back of his neck, but the compulsion to glance over his shoulder was too strong. Just once. He turned his head. The old man was still standing in the doorway of the gas station, staring at him, his milky eyes unblinking. But there was no motion behind them, no sense that the man had any intention of doing anything other than watching him. And so, Marcus ignored the rising sense of unease and finished pumping the gas. He clicked the nozzle back into place and wiped his hands on his jacket, all the while feeling that prickling sensation at the back of his neck. But then something odd caught his attention. He had barely noticed it before, hidden behind the faded neon sign that flickered above the door. There was a sign that read, "Restroom," in faded white letters. Nothing special, but the word restroom suddenly stood out to Marcus in a strange, unsettling way. Why did it feel like it had no business being there? He shook it off. It was just a gas station in the middle of nowhere, and it was probably the only one for miles. He needed to leave. But then, the door creaked open. The old man stepped out, slowly, his body swaying just slightly as he moved. Marcus stood still, frozen in place for a moment, unsure if he should keep walking, if he should turn and run, or if he should just get in the Jeep and leave. But the man's gaze never wavered. He didn't speak, didn't move any faster, and Marcus was left with no choice but to continue toward his Jeep. It was almost as though the man wasn't even real. Just a thing, a shape, a presence. Marcus didn't know if it was the mist, the late hour, or the constant, monotonous hum of the world around him, but he suddenly felt very alone, as though nothing existed except for him, the old man, and the fog. He was the only one who could feel the tension, the weight in the air. No one would believe him if he told them. No one would understand. But then, the door creaked again, louder this time, as if it were groaning beneath some unseen pressure. Marcus stopped. He didn't want to turn around, but he did. His feet felt heavy, like he was wading through the fog itself. The man was still standing there, motionless. His face, he couldn't see it in detail, but he could tell it wasn't right. Something was wrong with it, something unsettlingly wrong. Marcus blinked. When he opened his eyes, the man was gone. He blinked again. There was no one in the doorway, no one on the steps. But the door was still open. Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. It sank into his chest, twisting and turning, but he couldn't stop himself from walking toward the entrance. Why was he walking toward the door? He didn't want to. He knew he should get in the Jeep and drive away, but the door beckoned to him like a siren's song. It felt inevitable. But then, a voice, raspy and low, came from the shadows. "Need a place to stay?" The words were barely audible, muffled beneath the hum of the fog and the distant sound of his own breathing, but they were unmistakable. Marcus froze. He looked around. There was no one in sight, and yet he could have sworn the voice was coming from behind him. The gas station, the fog, everything seemed to blur together into one single thick haze. His feet shuffled to a halt, but his mind kept pushing him forward. Need a place to stay? He should leave. He had to leave. But something about the voice made him feel like he had no choice. The man's voice felt like it was threading itself through his mind, pulling him forward, pulling him toward the door that shouldn't be there. But then, he stepped inside. The door was still open, just slightly ajar. The light flickered dimly, revealing the same dusty shelves, the same empty, disheveled aisles. There was no one behind the counter anymore, not the old man, not anyone, just silence. Marcus stepped forward, his boots sinking into the thick carpet of dust on the floor. He felt like an intruder, but he didn't know why. The fog outside seemed louder now, pushing against the walls of the gas station, as if it were trying to force its way inside. The air smelled stale and damp, thick with mildew. The walls were lined with old newspapers and faded photographs, pinned haphazardly as though someone had tried to preserve them, but had long since lost interest in maintaining order. And then, a new sound. Footsteps. But these weren't his. They were slow, heavy. Marcus stood perfectly still, his pulse quickening, the air thick with the sound of his own heartbeat. The footsteps grew louder, and then he saw something move from the corner of his eye, a shadow. He whipped around, his heart pounding. There was nothing there. But then, he heard the creak of wood, as though someone was stepping on a floorboard. He didn't know why, but his feet moved toward the sound, drawn in by the pull by the voice that whispered in his mind. Need a place to stay? The voice again. Close this time. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. They dragged him forward, step by slow step. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing unusual, just the same shelves of cans, the same rusted old refrigerators humming in the corner. But as he turned toward the back where the restroom sign pointed, something shifted. The door. The restroom door was wide open. Marcus didn't want to go inside. He had no reason to. But then, his hand reached out. He couldn't stop it. He didn't know why. The door creaked open slowly, and he stepped into the dark hallway beyond. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the air grew heavier with each breath he took. He could almost hear the beating of his own heart in his ears, like a drum, like a warning. There were no lights back here, no sign of anyone. But then, the lights flickered on. They didn't flicker like regular lights. They flickered in a way that made him feel like they were watching him. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long across the walls, and the air grew colder, colder still. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. His head spun, and he couldn't focus on anything but the sensation of being watched. The door behind him slammed shut. He whipped around, heart in his throat, but there was no one there. He was alone, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I need to leave, he thought. But then, the floor beneath him shifted. The walls groaned, and suddenly, it felt as if everything was closing in. The door, the room, the very gas station. It wasn't real. But then, a sound, a movement. Something was behind him. It was too late now. Marcus didn't want to turn around. He had felt it before. That creeping sensation, that undeniable sense that something was wrong. But now, as the air thickened and the darkness seemed to crawl closer, the feeling settled deep in his bones. He had no idea what was behind him, but every instinct in his body screamed to leave. The thing was, he couldn't move. It was as if the gas station itself had frozen him in place, as if the walls were closing in around him, pressing against his chest, forcing him to stay. But then, the sound again, a shuffle, a breath. Closer now, far too close, the air cold and damp against the back of his neck. The floor creaked beneath slow, deliberate footsteps, dragging across the dusty floorboards like the weight of the world. Marcus clenched his fists, his palms slick with sweat. He didn't want to look, didn't want to see what was behind him. But the urge to face it, to understand it, to make it real, was overpowering. He turned slowly, each movement heavier than the last. And there, standing in the doorway, was the old man. The same old man from before. But now his face was different. His eyes, those milky, vacant eyes, were wide open. They seemed to stretch across his face like two empty sockets, hollowed out by something far worse than age. The skin around his mouth hung loose and sagged, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth, too many teeth, jagged like a creature not meant to be human. Marcus's throat tightened, but he couldn't make a sound. His feet were glued to the floor. The old man didn't speak. He simply stood there, staring. His body was unnaturally still, but it felt like the room was vibrating with his presence. There was something wrong with the air, something dense, suffocating. It felt like time itself had stopped. Marcus's mind was racing, but no words came. His heart hammered in his chest, thumping so loudly it almost drowned out the silence. Why wasn't the man speaking? Why wasn't he moving? The longer Marcus stared at him, the less real the man seemed, as though he were part of the fog itself, something born from the darkness rather than the physical world. The man took a step forward. It was slow, deliberate, but the way the old man moved was wrong. It was as if his body didn't obey the same laws of physics as Marcus's. His legs seemed to bend at unnatural angles, his movements jerky and fragmented, like a puppet on strings being pulled by an invisible hand. The air around Marcus thickened, the very walls pulsating as if they were breathing. He could hear the sound of his own breath, shallow and ragged, echoing through the gas station's empty halls. He tried to move, tried to run, but his body refused. He couldn't lift a foot. His muscles were locked, frozen by the overwhelming presence of the old man. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, but he couldn't move. The tension in the air was palpable, thickening with each passing second, suffocating him. The man's lips peeled back, revealing a smile. But it wasn't a smile, it was a grimace, a grotesque stretching of skin over something more sinister, something hungry. The man's eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. And then, without a word, he took another step forward. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the movement itself, it was the certainty that came with it. The old man wasn't walking toward him. No, the old man was walking toward something else, something hidden in the shadows of the hallway. For the first time since he'd entered the gas station, Marcus's gaze was drawn to the restroom door. The door that had been wide open earlier. The door that now seemed to beckon him, calling him into the dark. He hadn't noticed it before, but now there was something strange about the doorway. It seemed deeper than it should have been. The walls surrounding it warped, bending in odd angles, as though the hallway itself was stretching and pulling to contain whatever was lurking inside. And then, the voice again. Need a place to stay? It was no longer a question, it was a command. Marcus's body refused to move, even as his mind screamed at him to get out, to run, to do anything but stand there. The fog outside was nothing compared to the pressure that weighed on him now. The air inside the gas station had become heavy with an oppressive, thickened force that made it hard to breathe. It felt as though the very essence of the place was closing in on him. He couldn't escape. The old man's grin widened. It stretched impossibly wide, as if his jaw was unhinging, stretching past what should have been humanly possible. The smile didn't stop. It went on and on and on, until it felt like it was consuming the entire room. Marcus stumbled backward, finally able to move, but the world around him seemed to close in faster. The shadows danced on the walls, flickering and shifting like the movement of some unseen entity. He didn't know where he was going. He didn't know what to do. But the door was still there, the restroom. The place that was calling him. He could hear something faint and distant, whispering from within. Need a place to stay? The words twisted into something darker, more malicious, as though the very room was repeating them in unison with the voice. The gas station seemed to pulse, the walls breathing, expanding and contracting. And through it all, the old man stood motionless, watching him, waiting. Marcus didn't understand. He couldn't understand. His mind was too clouded, too overwhelmed by the suffocating presence of the gas station, the man, the voice. It was all closing in. But then, the restroom door swung shut. The loud, abrupt slam echoed through the station like a gunshot, breaking the spell, snapping Marcus out of the trance that had held him there. His head cleared for a split second, and his body jerked into action. He turned and ran. His feet pounded against the dust-coated floor, each step a desperate attempt to escape. He didn't care about the old man anymore. He didn't care about the restroom. All that mattered now was the exit, the door, the way out. But just as he reached the front door, just as his fingers brushed the handle, he felt it, the pressure. The invisible weight that had been pressing on him all along was gone. He was free. But then, the door wouldn't open. He pulled harder, his heart racing in his chest, his mind frantic. It was locked. The door was locked from the outside. And then, the low hum began again, filling the air. The gas station, the world around him, seemed to hum with life, a quiet, oppressive drone that rattled in his bones. The walls were shaking now, the light flickering violently. The shadows seemed to grow taller, stretching toward him, dark tendrils reaching out to claim him. The voice came again, not from the restroom, not from the old man. It came from everywhere. Need a place to stay? Marcus slammed his fist into the door, desperation turning to panic. It wouldn't open. The voice was everywhere, echoing, surrounding him. There was no escape. But then, the light went out. The world was plunged into darkness. The hum stopped. The gas station was silent again. And in the pitch-black void, Marcus heard one last whisper. "We're waiting." If you ever find yourself driving through the Pacific Northwest and you see an old gas station that feels off, trust me, keep driving. Some places aren't meant to be explored. What do you think happened to Marcus? Drop your theories in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if it gave you chills. Subscribe for more spine-tingling stories just like this, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, but maybe don't stop at every gas station you see. See you in the next one.